The check sat soaking in a puddle of expensive Cabernet. My father laughed, slurring. $5 million? Is he buying the city? The room erupted like a pack of hyenas while Mom live-streamed the senile joke to Instagram. I just slid my check into my wallet. They pitied me then, but the laughter died exactly 72 hours later. That single banking notification wasn't just money. It was the sound of my freedom and the absolute death knell for their arrogance. My name is Iris Silverton, to the world outside the sub-basement levels of Nexus Archives. I was a ghost. To my family. I was something worse. I was a disappointment. At 32 years old, I had failed to marry a hedge fund manager or launch a luxury skincare line. Instead, I cataloged dust and old corporate tax records for a private firm that paid me just enough to keep the heat on in a drafty two-bedroom walk-up on the wrong side of the tracks. I drove a car that sounded like a dying tractor and wore clothes that were practical rather than performative, in the eyes of the Silverton dynasty. I was a clerical error that they had unfortunately been unable to delete. I was not the only error. However, I lived with the original mistake. My grandfather, Arthur Silverton. If you asked my father, Richard, or my mother, Sylvia, they would tell you that Arthur was a burden. They would sigh theatrically and talk about the immense emotional toll of caring for an elderly relative, neglecting to mention that they had not visited him in 3 years. To them, he was a senile old man who smelled of mothballs and cheap soap, a relic who had somehow squandered whatever opportunities he had in his youth to end up living on a meager pension. They claimed he was losing his mind, citing his long silences and his tendency to stare out the window for hours at a time. They did not understand that he was not vacant. He was just tired of their noise. It was Christmas Eve in Oak Ridge, Connecticut, a town that felt less like a community and more like a competitive sport. The snow was falling in thick, heavy sheets, coating the world in a pristine white that hid the grime underneath. It was the kind of weather that made you want to curl up with a book and forget the world existed. But my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, shattering the peace of our small apartment. The message was from my mother. It was not a greeting. It was a summons. Bring Grandpa to the house by 6:00. We need the 3-generation photo for the feed. Do not be late. And try to make him look presentable. Love, Mom. I stared at the screen. There was no inquiry about our health. There was no warmth. There was only the demand for props. The annual Christmas photo was a sacred ritual for Sylvia Silverton. It was the centerpiece of her social media presence, a carefully curated image of familial bliss that would garner thousands of likes from people who secretly hated her. They needed Arthur there to play the role of the beloved patriarch, the anchor of their generational wealth narrative, even though they treated him like furniture the other 364 days of the year. I looked over at Arthur. He was sitting in his favorite armchair, a ragged wingback that we had salvaged from a curbside sale. He was reading a newspaper that was 2 days old, his glasses perched precariously on the end of his nose. He looked frail. The winter had been hard on his joints, and our apartment was never quite warm enough. The idea of dragging him out into the snow, driving 40 minutes to the Silverton estate, and subjecting him to the sharp tongues of my parents and brother made my stomach turn. "We do not have to go," I said, my voice quiet. "I can tell them the car won't start, or that you are not feeling well." Arthur lowered the paper. His eyes were a washed-out blue, usually clouded with what I assumed was fatigue. But today they looked different. There was a clarity there, a sharpness that I had not seen in years. "No, Iris," he said. His voice was raspy but steady. "We are going." "But why?" I asked, frustration bubbling up. "You know how they are. They just want the photo. Once the shutter clicks, they will stick you in the corner and ignore you. I do not want to see them treat you like that again." He folded the newspaper with precise, deliberate movements. "Let them take their photo," he said. "I have something for them. It is Christmas, after all." He stood up, his joints popping audibly, and walked to his small bedroom. When he emerged 10 minutes later, I had to suppress a gasp. He was wearing a suit I had not seen in a decade. It was a chocolate-brown polyester three-piece from the 1970s, with lapels wide enough to land a plane on. It was hopelessly out of date. The kind of outfit that would make my fashion-obsessed mother scream internally. Yet, he had pressed it. The shirt was starch white, and he had polished his worn leather shoes until they held a dull shine. He looked ridiculous by modern standards, but he carried himself with a strange, solemn dignity. He patted the left breast pocket of his jacket. "Are those cards?" I asked. "Something like that," he replied. I saw the edges of 3 plain white envelopes peeking out. They were crisp, stark against the brown fabric. There were no ribbons, no festive stamps, just 3 white rectangles. He pushed them deeper into the pocket, close to his heart. "Ready?" he asked. "Grandpa, are you sure?" I pressed one last time. "It is going to be a circus." "I like the circus," he said, a faint, dry smile touching his lips. "Especially the clowns." We went out into the cold. My car, a 10-year-old sedan with a rusting undercarriage and a heater that only worked when the vehicle was moving faster than 40 miles per hour, sat buried under 6 inches of snow. I spent 10 minutes scraping the windshield while Arthur sat inside, his breath fogging up the glass. When the engine finally turned over, it coughed and sputtered like a dying animal before settling into a rhythmic rattle. The drive to the heights of Oak Ridge was a journey between 2 worlds. We left the gray, salt-stained streets of our neighborhood, passing strip malls and gas stations, and slowly ascended into the hills where the driveways were heated and the trees were wrapped in thousands of tiny white lights. As we approached the Silverton estate, the anxiety in my chest tightened into a hard knot. The gates were open, revealing a long, winding driveway lined with imported pine trees. The house itself was a monstrosity of modern architecture, glass, steel, and stone, designed to look imposing rather than inviting. It glowed in the night, every window blazing with light, a beacon of consumption. The driveway was already full. I navigated my rattling sedan between a sleek black Porsche and a massive Range Rover that cost more than my entire college education. My car looked like a dirty blemish on a pristine canvas. I parked as far to the side as I could, hoping to minimize the visual offense. "Showtime," Arthur whispered. I helped him out of the car. The wind was biting, cutting through my coat. But Arthur did not shiver. He buttoned his brown jacket and straightened his tie. I took his arm, feeling the frailty of his bones beneath the layers of fabric, and we walked toward the massive oak double doors. Before I could ring the bell, the door swung open. It was Lance. My older brother was 35, a self-proclaimed visionary in the world of cryptocurrency and decentralized finance. He was wearing a velvet blazer that likely cost $3,000 and loafers with no socks. His smile was bright, practiced, and didn't reach his eyes. "Finally," Lance said, checking his smartwatch. "Mom was about to have an aneurysm. She wants the lighting from the Blue Hour, and we missed it." He stepped back to let us in, and then his eyes landed on Arthur. His smile curdled into a sneer of amusement. "Whoa," Lance laughed, a sharp, barking sound. "Grandpa, what is that? Did you rob a museum exhibit on the way here? Or is disco making a comeback in the nursing home demographic?" I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. "Lance, stop it." "What?" Lance held up his hands in mock innocence. "I am just saying, it is a bold look, very vintage poverty." Arthur did not flinch. He did not look down at his clothes in shame. He simply looked at Lance, his expression unreadable. "It is my best suit," Arthur said softly. "Clearly," Lance scoffed. "Just try not to stand near the hors d'oeuvres, okay? You smell like an attic." He turned on his heel and walked back into the foyer, shouting for our mother. "They are here, and wait until you see the wardrobe malfunction." I squeezed Arthur's arm, my heart hammering against my ribs. I wanted to turn around. I wanted to drag him back to the car and drive away, leaving them to their hollow celebration. But Arthur placed his hand over mine. His skin was paper thin, but his grip was surprisingly firm. 2 hours. I whispered to myself. A mantra of survival. Just 2 hours. We eat, we take the picture, and we leave. I helped him out of his coat, revealing the full glory of the brown suit. I brushed a snowflake from his shoulder. I thought I knew how this night would go. I thought it would be the same as every year. The insults masked as jokes, the aggressive neglect, the display of wealth designed to make us feel small. I was wrong. As we stepped into the grand hallway, beneath the crystal chandelier that cost more than 5 years of Arthur's pension, I had no idea that the 3 envelopes resting against my grandfather's chest were not just paper. They were landmines, and Arthur Silverton, the quiet, overlooked old man in the brown suit, had just walked into the center of the room with his finger on the detonator. The interior of the Silverton estate was not designed for living. It was designed for envy. As I guided my grandfather through the foyer, the sheer scale of the performative wealth hit me like a physical blow. The air inside was warmer than the blizzard outside, but it felt chemically stale. Scented heavily with cinnamon and pine from hidden diffusers that likely cost more than my weekly grocery budget. Dominating the main living space was the Christmas tree. It was a monstrous thing, standing at least 12 feet tall, its tip brushing the coffered ceiling. It was not decorated with sentimental ornaments or childhood crafts. There were no macaroni stars or faded baubles from years past. Instead, it was strangled by ribbons of gold mesh and hundreds of identical, oversized glass spheres that shimmered under the recessed lighting. It looked less like a holiday tradition and more like a display window at a Fifth Avenue department store. Underneath the tree lay a mountain of gifts, wrapped in paper so thick and glossy it looked like sheet metal, all coordinated in shades of cream and gold. It was a shrine to materialism, and we were the pilgrims who had arrived empty-handed. My father, Richard, was holding court near the fireplace. The mantle was draped in garland that looked synthetic, but was probably real and imported from some rare Nordic forest. He held a crystal tumbler of amber liquid, swirling it with the practiced ease of a man who spent more time networking than working. He was surrounded by 3 men in dark suits, potential investors or creditors he was trying to dazzle. I could not tell the difference anymore. "The Highland Project is a guaranteed winner," Richard was saying, his voice booming with a confidence that made my skin crawl. "We are talking about a $20 million return on investment within the first 18 months. I have the zoning board in my back pocket. It is a done deal." I stood by the archway, gripping Arthur's arm, and felt a wave of nausea. A $20 million return? Just last week, I had stopped by the house to drop off some mail that had been sent to my old address. I had overheard Richard in his study, his voice a frantic whisper, pleading with someone named Vinny for just 30 more days to liquefy an asset. He was drowning in debt, leveraging one loan to pay the interest on another, a house of cards built on a fault line. Yet here he was, puffing out his chest, selling a fantasy to men who nodded along, blinded by the expensive scotch and the rented tuxedo, before I could find a quiet spot for Arthur. A hand clamped onto my elbow. It was manicured, the nails painted a blood red that matched the poinsettias. "Iris," my mother hissed. Sylvia Silverton did not walk. She glided. She was wearing a silver gown that clung to her frame, her face a mask of perfectly applied foundation and subtle surgical enhancements. She steered me away from the main group and into the kitchen, a cavernous space filled with white marble and stainless steel appliances that had never cooked a single meal. "What are you wearing?" she asked, her voice low but cutting. She looked me up and down with the clinical detachment of a health inspector finding a cockroach in a salad. "It is a dress, Mom," I said, pulling my arm away. "It is clean and it fits." "It looks like something a librarian would wear to a funeral," she snapped. "Look at the hemline. It is fraying. And those shoes? Iris, we have the regional vice president of Chase Bank in the living room. Do you have any idea how bad this looks for the brand? We are selling success. You look like a charity case." "I am a terrifyingly accurate representation of my bank account," I retorted, though I kept my voice down. Maybe if you want me to dress like a runway model, you shouldn't have cut me off the day I graduated. We cut you off to build your character, she said, checking her reflection in the dark glass of the oven door. Clearly, it hasn't worked. Just stay in the back, and keep your grandfather away from the appetizers. I do not want him spilling sauce on the Persian rug again. It cost $12,000 to import. She turned on her heel and swept back into the party, her smile reattaching itself to her face instantly as she greeted a guest. I took a deep breath, counting to 10, and went back to rescue Arthur. I found him standing exactly where I had left him, looking like a lost time traveler in his brown suit. The guests were giving him a wide berth, flowing around him like water around a rock in a stream. No one spoke to him, no one offered to take his coat. He was an anomaly in their perfect tableau, a reminder of age and decay that they wanted to ignore. "Come on, Grandpa," I said gently. "Let's find a seat." I led him to a seating area in the far corner of the room, tucked behind a massive potted palm tree. It was the kids' table, equivalent for the elderly. I settled him into a stiff velvet chair and sat on the ottoman beside him. From this vantage point, we had a perfect view of the theater playing out before us. My brother, Lance, had seized the center of the room. He was sitting on the edge of the plush cream sofa, his legs spread wide in a display of arrogance. His wife, a woman named Brittany, who communicated mostly in giggles and nods, sat beside him, clutching a glass of champagne like a lifeline. "So there we were in Dubai," Lance was shouting, ensuring everyone within a 50-foot radius could hear him. "The Burj Al Arab. You have to go. We took the helicopter tour. Naturally. The pilot let me take the stick for a minute. Intense. Then we had dinner underwater. Literally underwater. The bill came to $4,000 for 2 people. But honestly, worth every penny for the content alone." "It was so magical," Brittany chimed in. "The gold cappuccino was almost too pretty to drink." "Almost," Lance laughed. "But we drank it. Tasted like success." I looked at Arthur. He was staring at Lance, his expression unreadable. His hands were resting on his knees, still and patient. I wondered what he was thinking. Was he remembering the days when he worked 14 hours a day at the steel mill? Was he thinking about the modest house he had built with his own hands? The one my father had sold the moment Arthur moved in with me? "Thirsty," Arthur whispered. His voice was dry, cracking in the dry heat of the house. "I will get you some water," I said. I stood up and walked toward the bar set up near the dining room. A caterer in a black vest was busy mixing a complex cocktail for one of my father's friends. "Excuse me," I said. "Could I get a glass of water, please?" The bartender glanced at me, then looked past me to where Lance was waving his empty glass. "1 second. Sweetheart, Mr. Silverton needs a refill." He ignored me and rushed over to Lance with a bottle of Dom Perignon. I stood there, stunned. I was the daughter of the house, yet I ranked lower than the catering staff's tip expectations. I looked around. My father was laughing at a joke I was sure wasn't funny. My mother was showing a woman her diamond tennis bracelet, making sure the light caught the stones. No one looked at me. No one looked at the old man in the corner who just wanted a glass of water. I walked behind the bar myself, grabbed a crystal tumbler, and filled it from a pitcher. The bartender glared at me when he returned. But I didn't care. I walked back to Arthur, my hands shaking with suppressed rage. "Here," I said, handing him the glass. "I am sorry." He took it with a nod. "Thank you. Iris?" He took a small sip. "The water tastes the same here as it does at home." "It is probably tap water anyway," I muttered. The evening dragged on in an agonizing loop of bragging and posturing. Dinner was a buffet of tiny, intricate foods that looked like art but tasted like cardboard, truffle-infused foam, deconstructed bruschetta, caviar on crackers the size of a dime. We were allowed to sit at the main table, but only at the very end, near the kitchen door where the draft was strongest, throughout the meal. The conversation drifted toward money, as it always did with the Silvertons. "So, Iris," my father said loudly, stabbing a fork into a piece of Wagyu beef, Still filing papers at that, what is it? A warehouse? Nexus Archives, I corrected him, keeping my eyes on my plate. It is a data preservation firm. We handle sensitive corporate history. Sounds dusty, Lance sneered. And what is the pay like these days? 30 grand a year? 40? It pays the bills, I said tightly. Does it? My mother chimed in, sipping her wine. Because I saw you still driving that rust bucket, honestly. Iris, if you just put a little effort into your appearance, Richard could introduce you to some of the junior associates at the firm. You are 32. The clock is ticking. You need to find someone to take care of you before you age out of the market. I can take care of myself, I said, my grip on my fork tightening until my knuckles turned white. Barely, Richard scoffed. If it wasn't for us letting you stay in the old apartment, I pay rent, I interrupted. I pay market rate rent to the landlord. You do not own that building anymore. Dad, remember? You sold it 4 years ago to cover the losses on the marina project. Silence descended on the table. It was heavy and dangerous. Richard's face turned a shade of purple that clashed with the garland. I did not sell it, he lied through his teeth. I reorganized my portfolio. You simply do not understand high-level finance. Iris, that is why you are a clerk. And Arthur, Lance pivoted, eager to kick someone else. How is the retirement life? Spending all day watching the paint peel? You know, we were thinking of putting you in a home, somewhere with professionals. Mom says you are getting too confused to be left alone. Arthur slowly lowered his fork. He wiped his mouth with the linen napkin, folding it neatly beside his plate. He looked at Lance, then at Richard, and finally at Sylvia. I am not confused, Arthur said softly. I see everything quite clearly. Sure you do. Pop, Richard laughed, signaling for more wine. Sure you do. Eventually, the clock struck 10. The guests began to filter out, collecting their fur coats and gift bags, the facade of the happy, prosperous family held up until the last taillight vanished down the driveway. Then, the transformation was instantaneous. The warmth evaporated from the room. Richard slumped onto the sofa, loosening his tie, his face sagging with exhaustion and alcohol. Sylvia kicked off her heels, grimacing as she massaged her feet. The house, once buzzing with chatter, now felt cavernous and hollow. The silence was not peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a tomb. God, what a nightmare, Sylvia groaned. Did you hear Mrs. Gable bragging about her new yacht? Tacky? Absolutely tacky. She is useful, Richard grunted, closing his eyes. Her husband sits on the zoning board. We need them. I need a drink, Lance said, heading for the bar. Acting interested in her boring charity stories depleted my dopamine levels. They were exhausted from the labor of their own lies. They were alone now. Just the family. This was the moment. The masks were on the floor. I looked at Arthur. He was sitting straight in his chair. Not slumping like the rest of them. He looked alert. He looked ready. He caught my eye and gave a barely perceptible nod. Then, he raised his hand and tapped the breast pocket of his brown suit. The sound was soft, but to me, it sounded like a war drum. Iris, Arthur said, his voice cutting through the complaints of the others. Help me up. I have something to say. Richard opened one eye. Can't it wait? Dad? We are tired. No, Arthur said. He stood up on his own, pushing against the table. It cannot wait. It is Christmas. And I have gifts. Lance snorted from the bar. Gifts? What did you do? Wrap up some hard candies from the drugstore? Something like that, Arthur said. I moved to his side, my heart pounding against my ribs. I knew what was in those envelopes, or at least, I knew they were envelopes. I had no idea that they contained the catalyst that would burn this house of lies to the ground. Gather round, Arthur commanded. It was not the voice of a senile old man. It was the voice of a patriarch. A tone I hadn't heard in 30 years. Reluctantly, rolling their eyes and sighing with exaggerated fatigue. My parents and brother gathered in the living room. They stood amidst the debris of their gluttony, empty glasses, crumpled napkins, the smell of stale ambition. They looked at Arthur with pity and annoyance, waiting for him to finish his little performance so they could go to sleep. They had no idea that the old man in the cheap suit was about to buy and sell them all. The silence that fell over the room was not respectful. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of impatience. My father, Richard, leaned back against the plush cushions of the sofa. His eyes glazed with the lingering effects of the expensive scotch and the exhaustion of performing his role as the successful patriarch for 5 straight hours. He tapped the face of his gold watch, a deliberate gesture meant to signal that Arthur was running out of borrowed time. My mother, Sylvia, was picking at a loose thread on a throw pillow, her mouth set in a tight line of annoyance. Lance was scrolling on his phone, the blue light illuminating his face in a ghostly pallor. Clearly disengaged from the reality of the room, Arthur stood in the center of the Persian rug. The one my mother had claimed was worth more than his life savings. He looked small against the backdrop of the 12-foot tree and the mountain of gold-wrapped gifts, but there was a strange, vibrating intensity radiating from him. His hands, spotted with age and trembling slightly from a tremor he tried hard to hide, were clasped in front of him. He cleared his throat, a dry, raspy sound that seemed to scratch against the polished veneer of the room. "Family," Arthur began, his voice wavering but gaining strength with each syllable. "Christmas is a time for reflection. It is a time when the noise of the world quiets down, and we are left with the truth of who we are." "Oh, God," Lance muttered under his breath, not bothering to look up from his screen. "Here comes the ghost of Christmas past." Arthur ignored him. He looked directly at Richard, then at Sylvia, his gaze lingering on them with a mixture of sadness and a piercing clarity that made me shiver. "I have lived a long life," Arthur continued. "I have seen seasons come and go. I have seen fortunes built and lost, but in the winter of my life, I have learned that the only currency that truly matters is not what sits in a bank account. It is respect. It is kindness. It is the time we give to one another when there is nothing to gain from it." Richard sighed loudly, a sound that was half groan, half laugh. "Dad, we really do not need a sermon tonight. It has been a long day. We appreciate the sentiment, but let's wrap this up, shall we?" "Regret," Arthur said, his voice rising slightly to cut over Richard's dismissal. "That is the ghost that haunts the loudest. I do not want to leave this world with regrets. I do not want to leave you with them, either." Sylvia rolled her eyes so hard, I thought they might get stuck in her head. "Arthur, please, you are tired. You are rambling. Iris, get his coat. He is clearly sundowning." "I am not done," Arthur said. The sharpness in his tone surprised them. For a brief second, the room went still. He reached into the inner pocket of his brown polyester jacket. The movement was slow, deliberate, agonizingly drawn out. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew he had the envelopes, but seeing him pull them out felt like watching a magician draw a sword instead of a rabbit. He withdrew the 3 plain white envelopes. They were stark, unadorned, and looked incredibly cheap against the backdrop of the opulent room. There were no gold ribbons, no foil stamping, no professional calligraphy, just plain, office supply store envelopes that cost pennies a box. "I have gifts," Arthur said. "They are not much to look at, but I want you to have them." He took a step forward, his legs shaking, and extended the first envelope toward Richard and Sylvia. My father took it with 2 fingers. As if he were picking up a used tissue, he didn't even look at it. He just placed it on the coffee table beside his empty glass. "Thanks, Dad," Richard said flatly. "We will open it later." "Open it now," Arthur commanded. "Please." Richard exchanged a look with Sylvia, a look that said, "Let's just humor the old man so he leaves." With a heavy sigh of martyrdom, Richard picked the envelope back up. Arthur turned to Lance. My brother finally looked up from his phone. Seeing the envelope hovering in front of him, he smirked. a cruel twist of his lips. "What is this, Grandpa?" Lance asked, snatching the envelope from Arthur's hand with a quick, aggressive jerk. "A gift card to Applebee's? Or did you find a $10 bill on the sidewalk?" "Open it," Arthur repeated. Finally. He turned to me, his eyes softened, the steel left his gaze, replaced by a warmth that made my throat tight. He handed me the last envelope. "For you, Iris." I took it with both hands. It felt light, insubstantial. "Go on," Arthur said to the room. "Open them." Lance was the first. He didn't use a letter opener. He jammed his thumb under the flap and ripped the paper apart with a violent, tearing sound. He pulled out the single slip of paper inside. It was a personal check. I watched his face closely. I expected disappointment. I expected him to sneer at a check for $50 or perhaps $100. Lance stared at the paper. He blinked. He brought it closer to his face, squinting in the dim mood lighting. Then, he froze. His mouth fell open, just a fraction, before curling up into a wide, incredulous grin. A sound bubbled up from his throat. A laugh. But it wasn't a joyful laugh. It was the barking, derisive laugh of someone who has just heard the world's most ridiculous joke. "No way," Lance choked out, shaking his head. "No absolute way." "What is it?" Sylvia asked, leaning forward, her interest piqued by his reaction. Lance held up the check, waving it in the air like a flag of surrender. $5 million, he shouted. "The old man wrote me a check for $5 million. The silence shattered. Richard dropped his glass. It didn't break, but it clattered loudly against the table. He ripped his own envelope open, his movements frantic now, driven by a sudden, mocking curiosity. Sylvia leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the paper as Richard pulled it out. There it was, in Arthur's shaky, spiderweb handwriting, $5,000,000 over $100. Richard stared at it for a second, and then he joined Lance. The laughter started low in his chest and erupted into a roar. It was a contagious, ugly sound. Sylvia covered her mouth, giggling uncontrollably, her shoulders shaking. "Oh, Dad," Richard gasped, wiping a tear from his eye. "Oh, this is rich. This is priceless." He waved the check at Arthur, who stood motionless in the center of their mockery. $5 million? Bypassing the fact that you do not have $500, let alone $5 million. What is this? Is this play money? Did you print this off the internet? "It is a legal tender," Arthur said quietly. His voice was drowned out by the cacophony of their amusement. "Legal tender," Lance howled, slapping his knee. "Did you hear that? He thinks it is real. Grandpa, your account probably has cobwebs in it. If I tried to cash this, the bank would not just laugh at me. They would arrest me for fraud." "It is a metaphor." "Obviously," Sylvia chimed in, her voice high and shrill. "It is symbolic, right? Arthur, you are giving us the value of your love, or your wisdom, because that is the only thing you have 5 million of, brain cells that are misfiring." "It is a check," Arthur said again, his posture rigid. "It is valid." "Valid?" Richard scoffed. He picked up his glass of scotch, realized it was empty, and set it down hard. "Dad, stop it. It is embarrassing. You are embarrassing yourself. You write checks for millions of dollars when I know for a fact you struggle to buy your own blood pressure medication. What is the point of this? To make us look like fools? To pretend you are some big shot? You are a retired factory worker. Dad, you are not Warren Buffett." The cruelty in the room was physical. It felt like the air was being sucked out, replaced by a toxic gas of arrogance. They were not just rejecting the gift, they were rejecting him. They were stripping him of his dignity, layer by layer, and enjoying the process. Lance stood up. He looked at the check in his hand one last time, shaking his head in mock pity. Then, with a casual, fluid motion, he crushed the paper in his fist. He squeezed it into a tight, jagged ball. "Well," Lance said, his voice dripping with venom. "Thanks for the toilet paper. Grandpa, I will keep it as a souvenir, a reminder that senility is a hell of a drug." He drew his arm back and threw the paper ball. It hit Arthur squarely in the chest. The sound was soft, a light thwack against the polyester suit, but it echoed in my ears like a gunshot. The paper ball bounced off Arthur's chest and fell to the floor, rolling to a stop near his scuffed shoes. Arthur did not flinch. He did not step back. He simply looked down at the crumpled ball of paper, then back up at his grandson. His face was unreadable, a mask of stone, but I saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. "Lance!" I shouted, the word tearing out of my throat before I could stop it. "That is enough." "Oh, lighten up, Iris," Lance shot back. "He does not know what is happening. Look at him. He is in La La Land." "Actually," Sylvia said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper as if Arthur wasn't standing right there. "This is serious. Richard, delusions of grandeur, giving away vast sums of money he does not have. It is a classic symptom. We really need to look into the Shady Pines facility. If he starts writing checks to strangers, he could get into legal trouble. We need to take power of attorney, immediately." "You are probably right," Richard agreed, pouring himself another drink. "We will call the lawyer on Monday. This is just sad." They went back to their drinks, back to their phones, dismissing Arthur as if he were a television set that had been turned off. The show was over. The joke had been told. I sat there, frozen. My hands were trembling as I held my own envelope. The laughter of my family still rang in my ears. A discordant soundtrack to the tragedy unfolding before me. I looked at Arthur. He was looking at me. He wasn't looking at the paper ball on the floor. He was looking directly into my eyes, waiting, slowly, with numb fingers. I slid my finger under the flap of my envelope. I pulled out the check. I laid it flat on my lap, smoothing out the creases. Paid to the order of Iris Silverton. Amount, $5,000,000 over $100. I looked at the signature line. Arthur J. Silverton. The handwriting was shaky. Yes, the ink was a basic blue ballpoint. The check itself was a standard personal check from a local bank, the kind with a picture of a lighthouse in the background. It looked utterly ordinary, but as I stared at the numbers, 5,0,0,0,0,0, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. A weight settled in my stomach, cold and heavy. This wasn't a joke. I knew my grandfather. I knew the way he meticulously balanced his checkbook every Sunday. I knew he would never, ever write a check he could not cash. He was a man of honor, a man who believed a man's word was his bond. Writing a bad check would be a sin to him. He wasn't crazy. I looked up at him again. He offered me a very small, very sad smile. It was a smile of resignation, a smile that said, "Now you see." I did not laugh. I could not laugh. The piece of paper in my hand felt heavy, heavier than lead, heavier than the entire house. It felt like a test, and while my parents and brother were busy laughing at the absurdity of the question, I was the only one realizing that the exam had already begun. "Grandpa," I whispered, the sound lost in the noise of my family's mockery. Arthur just gave a single, sharp nod. He reached down, not to pick up the crumpled check Lance had thrown, but to brush a speck of invisible dust from his trousers. "Let's go, Iris," he said, his voice cutting through the laughter like a knife. "I am tired." The laughter in the room did not fade naturally. It had to be strangled. I stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor, a sound that cut through the cacophony of their amusement like a scream. The sudden movement drew their attention, not because they cared about my reaction, but because I had interrupted their sport. My mother paused mid-giggle, her hand hovering over her mouth. Lance looked up, his eyes still bright with the cruelty of his joke. Richard swirled his drink, looking at me with a mixture of boredom and irritation. I did not look at them, not yet. I walked over to where my grandfather stood. He had not moved an inch. He was staring at the crumpled ball of paper near his shoe, his posture straight, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked like a statue of dignity amidst a storm of garbage. I knelt down. The knees of my dress hit the floor, but I did not care. I reached out and picked up the paper ball. It felt light, fragile, like a wounded bird, slowly, deliberately. I stood up. I walked to the coffee table, the center of their opulent universe. I placed the paper down and began to smooth it out. I pressed my palm against the creases Lance had made, flattening the edges, trying to restore some semblance of respect to the document. The sound of the paper crinkling was the only noise in the room. When it was flat, I turned to face them. "This is disgusting," I said. My voice was not loud, but it was shaking, not with fear, but with a rage so cold it felt like ice in my veins. "He is your father. He is your grandfather. He came here tonight, in the freezing cold, to give you everything he has. And you treat him like entertainment." My father sighed. A long, exaggerated exhalation of air that smelled of scotch and condescension. He set his glass down, right on top of the envelope Arthur had given him. "Oh, stop it. Iris," Richard said, waving a dismissive hand. "You always were too sensitive. You have no sense of humor. Can't you see the absurdity of this? He gave us checks for $5 million. It is a joke, a sad, delusional joke. We are just reacting to the reality of the situation." "It is not a joke to him," I replied, pointing at Arthur. "Look at him. Does he look like he is laughing?" They looked. Arthur was watching them, but for the first time that night, I saw something in his eyes that terrified me. The cloudiness was gone. The soft, apologetic look of the dependent elderly relative had vanished. In its place was a gaze as sharp and cold as a razor blade. He was studying them, dissecting them, cataloging every sneer and every roll of the eye. It was the look of a judge passing a final sentence, but they were too blinded by their own arrogance to see it. "He looks confused," Sylvia said, reapplying her lipstick. "He does not know where he is. Honestly, Iris, you are making a scene over nothing. Sit down and have a drink. You are ruining the vibe." "I am not staying," I said. "And neither is he." I walked back to Arthur and took his arm. "Come on, Grandpa, we are leaving." "But we have not taken the photo yet," Sylvia protested, her voice rising in panic. "The lighting is perfect right now. Iris, do not be selfish. Just 5 minutes." I ignored her. I guided Arthur toward the door, past the 12-foot tree, past the mountain of gold-wrapped lies. "Fine," Richard shouted after us. "Go, run away. Take your millions with you. Maybe you can buy a personality on the way home." He laughed at his own wit. As I reached the doorway, I looked back one last time. Richard picked up his glass of red wine. He lifted the envelope Arthur had given him, the one containing $5 million, and slid it directly under the base of the glass. He was using it as a coaster. He was using his inheritance to protect a table he didn't even own outright. "Goodbye, Dad," I whispered. Arthur did not say a word. He did not look back. He walked with a steady rhythm, his cane tapping against the marble floor, a metronome counting down the seconds of their demise. The cold air outside hit us like a slap, cleansing the perfume and pretension from our lungs. I helped Arthur into the passenger seat of my rusted sedan. He settled in, pulling his seatbelt across his chest. I got in the driver's side and slammed the door, sealing us in the quiet safety of the car. I started the engine. It groaned and rattled, a stark contrast to the purring engines of the luxury SUVs parked around us. I navigated down the long, winding driveway, leaving the blazing lights of the Silverton estate in the rear-view mirror. The drive home was silent. The only sound was the hum of the tires on the snow and the rhythmic swishing of the windshield wipers. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My mind was racing, a chaotic whirlwind of anger, shame, and confusion. I felt humiliated for him. I felt a deep, aching sorrow that his gesture of love, however delusional, had been met with such cruelty. I glanced over at him. He was staring out the window at the passing streetlights. His face was calm. There were no tears. There was no trembling. He looked peaceful, like a man who had just finished a long, difficult job. Suddenly, he reached out and covered my hand on the gear shift. His palm was warm and dry. "Iris," he said, "I am sorry." "Grandpa." I choked out, tears finally stinging my eyes. "I am so sorry. They are monsters. I should not have made you go." "Shh," he hushed me gently. "It went exactly as it needed to go." I glanced at him, confused. "What do you mean?" He squeezed my hand. "Tomorrow morning," he said, his voice low and serious. "I want you to go to the bank, the one on 4th Street. Take the check." "Grandpa," I sighed, my heart breaking all over again. "We do not have to pretend. It is okay. I know you wanted to do something nice, but—" "Listen to me," he interrupted. The command in his voice was absolute. It was not the voice of the man who needed help opening a jar of pickles. It was the voice of a man who was used to being obeyed. "Go to the bank. Deposit it. Do not ask questions. Do not doubt. Just trust me. Can you do that?" I looked at him. In the flickering light of the dashboard, I saw the intensity in his eyes. He wasn't asking for a favor. He was giving me instructions. "I trust you," I whispered. "I have always trusted you." "Good," he said. He patted my hand and turned back to the window. "That is all that matters." We arrived at our apartment building, a brick block that smelled of boiled cabbage and damp carpet. It was a palace compared to the mausoleum we had just left. I helped him up the stairs, unlocking the door to our small sanctuary. I helped him out of his brown suit. I hung it up carefully, brushing off the lint, treating it with more respect than my brother had treated a human being. I made him a cup of herbal tea and sat with him on the edge of his bed until he finished it. "Get some sleep, Iris," he said, handing me the empty cup. "Tomorrow is a big day." "Good night, Grandpa," I said, kissing his forehead. I turned off the light and went into the kitchen. The check was sitting on the laminate counter where I had left it. $5 million. I picked it up. It felt heavy in my hand again. I sat down at the small kitchen table, the buzzing of the refrigerator the only company I had. I stared at the numbers. 5 million. It was an impossible sum. It was enough to buy this entire building. It was enough to erase every mistake, every debt, every fear I had ever known. But it was a piece of paper. My mind began to spiral. Was this the first sign of dementia? Had he been hiding a decline from me? If I went to the bank tomorrow, would the teller laugh at me? Would they call the police? Would I be standing there, humiliated, while they explained that Arthur Silverton had $12 in his account? I imagined the scene, the pity in the teller's eyes, the whispers, "Poor girl. Her grandfather has lost his mind." I put my head in my hands. The logical part of my brain screamed at me to tear it up, to save us both the embarrassment, to protect his dignity by burying this delusion before the world saw it. My parents were right, weren't they? He was old. He was confused. But then I remembered his eyes in the car. It went exactly as it needed to go. I remembered the way he had stood in that living room, unyielding against the wave of mockery. I remembered the years he had raised me when my parents were too busy building their empire to care about a lonely little girl. He had never lied to me. He had never made a promise he didn't keep. When he said he would be at my school play, he was there. When he said he would help me with my homework, he did. He asked me for one thing: trust me. If I tore up this check, I would be doing exactly what my family did. I would be dismissing him. I would be deciding that my logic was superior to his word. I would be treating him like a child. I took a deep breath. I would go. I would go to the bank. I would stand there and hand them this piece of paper. If it bounced, if they laughed, if they called security, I would take it. I would absorb the humiliation for him. I would let the world think I was the fool, just so I could come home and tell him. I did what you asked. I would not break his heart. I would rather break my own pride than shatter his dignity. I folded the check carefully and placed it in my purse. Right next to my keys. I checked the time. It was 2 in the morning. I knew I wouldn't sleep. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl outside. In the next room, Arthur was sleeping soundly. He was the only one of us who was at peace, while my parents slept in their mansion surrounded by debt. And I lay awake in poverty surrounded by doubt. The old man in the brown suit was dreaming, and for the first time, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, his dreams were the only real things in this world. The bank branch on 4th Street was a building I had passed 1,000 times but rarely entered. It was a structure of gray stone and tinted glass, projecting an image of unshakable stability that felt entirely alien to my current state of mind. I parked my rusting sedan 2 blocks away, sandwiched between a delivery truck and a fire hydrant, because I was terrified that if I parked in the bank lot, someone would see my car and know immediately that I did not belong inside. I walked the 2 blocks with my head down, clutching my purse against my side as if I were smuggling state secrets. The check, that impossible, terrifying slip of paper, sat inside my wallet, tucked behind my expired library card. Every step felt like a march toward a guillotine. I had spent the entire night staring at the ceiling, rehearsing the humiliation. I could hear the tellers laugh. I could see the security guard escorting me out. I could feel the cold metal of handcuffs. "Just trust me," Arthur had said. I repeated those 3 words like a prayer as I pushed open the heavy glass doors. The air inside was aggressively climate-controlled, cool and smelling faintly of ozone and sanitizer. It was the day after Christmas, usually a quiet day for banking, but there were 3 people in line ahead of me. I took my place, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My palms were sweating. I wiped them surreptitiously on the fabric of my dress, hoping no one noticed. When it was finally my turn, I approached the window. The teller was a young woman with a name tag that read, Sarah. She looked bored. Her eyes glazed over from the monotony of the holiday shift. She was chewing gum with a slow, rhythmic motion that I found strangely hypnotic. "Morning," Sarah said, not looking up from her screen. "How can I help you?" I swallowed, my throat dry. "I need to make a deposit." I reached into my wallet and pulled out the check. My fingers were trembling so badly that I almost dropped it. I slid it across the marble counter, under the glass partition. Sarah picked it up. She looked at the date. She looked at the signature. Then, she looked at the amount. The chewing stopped. I watched her eyes widen. She blinked. Once, twice, as if trying to reset her vision. She brought the check closer to her face, tilting it to catch the light, likely checking for the watermarks that would prove it was a fake. "Is there a problem?" I asked, my voice coming out as a squeak. I was ready to grab the check, apologize for the prank, and run out the door. Sarah did not answer me. She typed something furiously onto her keyboard. A frown creased her forehead. She hit a button, and a small light above her station turned from green to red. "One moment, ma'am," she said. Her voice had changed. The boredom was gone, replaced by a sharp, professional alertness that terrified me. She picked up the phone at her station and whispered something I could not hear. She kept her eyes locked on the check, guarding it as if it were evidence at a crime scene. My stomach dropped to the floor. This was it. They were calling the police. They were calling the fraud department. I looked around, gauging the distance to the door. Could I make it? Could I just leave the check and run? "I can explain," I started to say, though I had no explanation. "My grandfather gave it to me. He is elderly, and I think maybe he made a mistake." "Ms. Silverton?" I froze. The voice came from behind the teller line. A door opened, and a man in a sharp navy suit stepped out. He was older, with silver hair and the kind of serious, grave demeanor that suggested he managed millions, not checking accounts. His badge read, "Mr. Henderson, branch manager." I braced myself for the scolding. I prepared myself to be told to leave. "Mr. Henderson walked around the counter and approached me, but he did not look angry. He did not look suspicious. He looked deferential. "Ms. Silverton," he repeated, extending a hand. I am Charles Henderson, the branch manager. Would you mind joining me in my office? We prefer to handle transactions of this magnitude in private. I stared at his hand. He wasn't kicking me out? Yes, I stammered. Of course. He led me away from the teller window, past the line of curious customers, to a glass-walled office at the back of the bank. He held the door open for me, gesturing for me to sit in one of the leather chairs. Can I get you anything? He asked, as he sat down behind his large mahogany desk. Water? Coffee? Espresso? Water, please, I said. He pressed a button on his intercom and ordered a bottle of sparkling water. Then, he folded his hands on the desk and looked at me. The check was sitting in the center of his blotter. Ms. Silverton, as you know, a deposit of $5 million is a significant event, he began, his tone smooth and practiced, especially via a personal check. Standard protocol requires us to verify the funds with the issuing institution before we can even begin to process the hold. I understand, I said. Look, if the funds are not there, it is okay. My grandfather is old. He might be confused. I do not want to cause any trouble. Mr. Henderson smiled, a tight, professional expression. We will find out shortly. I have my head of operations on the line with the issuing bank's high net worth division right now. He turned to his computer screen and began typing. The silence that filled the room was heavy and absolute. I sat there, sipping the expensive water I had been brought, watching the second hand on the wall clock tick by. Tick, tick, tick. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. Every second felt like a year. I was sweating through my coat. My mind was racing with scenarios. What if Arthur had written this check as a test, but he had forgotten he didn't have the money? What if he had been scammed and thought he had money he didn't? What if this was all a terrible misunderstanding that would end with my family being right? That he was just a senile old man who needed to be institutionalized? I gripped the arms of the chair. Trust me. Suddenly, the phone on Mr. Henderson's desk buzzed. A single, sharp tone. He picked up the receiver. Henderson here. He listened. His face remained impassive, betraying nothing. I held my breath, my lungs burning. I see, he said. Confirmed? Both authentication codes? Excellent. Thank you. He hung up the phone. He looked at the computer screen, hit a few keys, and then looked up at me. His face broke into a genuine, beaming smile. Well, Ms. Silverton, he said, I have good news. The transaction has been fully authorized. I blinked. What? The funds have been verified, he explained, leaning back in his chair. The issuing institution confirmed the validity of the instrument. The money is being transferred as we speak from the Arthur Holdings Trust. What? I asked. The words sounded foreign. The Arthur Holdings Trust, Henderson repeated, glancing at his screen. It is a private family trust, very robust, because the amount is substantial. There will be a standard clearing period. However, given the verification we just received, the funds should be fully available in your account within 24 to 48 hours. I sat there, stunned. The room seemed to tilt slightly to the left. It cleared? I whispered. Is it real? 100% real, Henderson said. He pushed a receipt toward me. Here is your deposit confirmation. Your current balance is showing as $5,004,200.12. The $5 million is in pending status, but it is locked in. I looked at the receipt. There were so many zeros. It looked like a phone number. Is there anything else I can help you with today? Henderson asked, treating me with the sudden reverence reserved for the ultra-wealthy. We have some excellent investment vehicles for high-capital clients. I would be happy to introduce you to our wealth management team. No, I said, standing up on shaky legs. No, thank you. I just need to go. Of course, he said, walking me to the door. Have a wonderful day, Ms. Silverton, and please, give our regards to your grandfather. I walked out of the bank in a daze. The world outside looked exactly the same as it had 20 minutes ago. The same gray sky, the same slush on the sidewalk. But everything had changed. The gravity had shifted. I got into my car and locked the doors. I pulled out my phone and dialed Arthur's number. "Come on, Grandpa," I whispered. "Pick up." It went to voicemail. "Hi, this is Arthur. Leave a message." "Grandpa!" I practically shouted into the phone. I went to the bank. It cleared. They said something about a trust? Arthur Holdings? What is going on? Please call me back. I am freaking out. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. My hands were shaking too hard to drive. I needed to calm down. I needed to process this. My phone lit up with a notification. It was Instagram, a live stream alert. Sylvia Silverton is live. Unboxing my Xmas goodies. I stared at the screen. A morbid curiosity took over. I tapped the notification. My mother's face filled the screen. She was sitting in the sunroom of the mansion, surrounded by orange Hermes boxes and black Chanel bags. She was wearing a silk robe and holding a glass of mimosa. She looked perfect. She looked happy. "And look at this, guys," she was saying to her camera, holding up a diamond bracelet. "Richard is just the best, isn't he? He knows exactly what I need. We had such a lovely, intimate family dinner last night. Just love and light." She laughed, that tinkling, fake laugh that I knew so well. "Someone is asking about Grandpa," she said, reading a comment. She rolled her eyes playfully. "Oh, Arthur is fine. He is just getting old. You know? He gets a little confused. He gave us these funny little gifts last night. Bless his heart. We just have to humor him." The camera shifted slightly as she reached for her drink. In the background, on the coffee table behind her. I saw it. The wine glass my father had used the night before was still sitting there, a dark purple stain at the bottom, and underneath the base of the glass, pinned down like a piece of trash, was the white envelope, the check for $5 million. It was sitting right there, in plain sight, collecting dust, being used to protect a table from a water ring. I stared at the screen, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in my throat. They were sitting on a fortune. They were drowning in debt, desperate for cash, terrified of the repo man, and the solution to all their problems was literally sitting under their noses. And they were too arrogant, too blinded by their own superiority, to pick it up. They thought it was fake. They thought he was fake. I closed the app. The contrast was sickening, but it also sparked a fire in my belly. Arthur Holdings Trust. I opened my browser. I typed the name into the search bar. Arthur Holdings. The first few results were generic, but then I scrolled down. I found a digitized archive of a business journal from Seattle, dated 1982. Headline: The Shadow Buyer of the Northwest. I clicked on it. The text was grainy, scanned from an old microfilm. Real estate insiders are buzzing about the mysterious entity known only as Arthur Holdings, which has quietly acquired over 3,000 acres of industrial land outside Seattle in the last 6 months. The firm, represented by a team of lawyers, has no public face, but records suggest a savvy strategy of buying distressed properties just before the tech boom I read on. There were more articles. One from 1995 about a massive sale of warehouse districts to a logistics company that would eventually become a global shipping giant. Another from 2010 about the acquisition of water rights in Nevada. The name appeared over and over again. Arthur Holdings, always described as quiet, conservative, and cash-heavy. I sat back in my seat, my head spinning. My grandfather wasn't a retired factory worker who lost his pension, or maybe he was, once, but he was also something else. He was a shark, a silent, patient, invisible shark who had been swimming beneath the surface for 40 years. He had built an empire in the shadows. He had amassed a fortune that my father, with all his flashy projects and loud networking events, could only dream of. And he had done it without ever buying a new suit, without ever bragging, without ever needing the validation of a camera lens. And he had tested us. He had handed us the keys to the kingdom in plain white envelopes. I looked at the bank receipt in my hand again. $5 million. It wasn't just money, it was a verdict. I was the only one who had passed. I started the car. The engine rattled. The same ugly sound as always. But I didn't hear it this time. All I could hear was the sound of the future rushing toward me. I put the car in gear and drove. I wasn't going back to my apartment. I was going to find my grandfather, and I was going to ask him to teach me everything. 48 hours, that was the timeline the bank manager, Mr. Henderson, had given me. 48 hours for the clearinghouse to verify that the check written by a retired factory worker on a beat-up kitchen table was actually backed by a fortune. I spent those 48 hours in a state of suspended animation. I went through the motions of my life, but I felt like I was walking underwater. I drove my rattling car. I ate instant oatmeal. I went to work at Nexus Archives, where the smell of decaying paper usually comforted me, but now felt like a cage. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would slam against my ribs, expecting the inevitable call from the bank telling me it was all a mistake. Or worse, a call from the police telling me I was under investigation for fraud. I was sitting at my desk in the basement level of the archives, surrounded by boxes of tax records from 1998. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with their usual headache-inducing frequency. My supervisor, a man named Gary who thought micromanagement was a leadership style, had just dropped a stack of unfiled manifests on my desk. "Need these done by 5. Iris," Gary grunted, not bothering to make eye contact. "And no overtime." "Budget cuts." "Sure, Gary," I said automatically. My voice sounded distant to my own ears. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 2:17 in the afternoon, exactly 47 hours and 30 minutes since I had walked out of the bank. I picked up a file, trying to focus on the numbers, but the numbers on the page kept blurring. All I could see were the zeros I had seen on that receipt. 5 million. It was a number that didn't make sense in the context of my life. It was a number that belonged to people like my parents, people who lived in the light, not people like me who lived in the basement. My phone was sitting face down on the desk. I had put it there to stop myself from checking the banking app every 30 seconds. Then, it happened. It wasn't a call. It was a single. Long vibration. A notification. The room seemed to go silent. The hum of the lights faded. The sound of Gary typing in the next cubicle disappeared. There was only the phone, vibrating against the cheap laminate of the desk. I reached out. My hand was shaking so badly I knocked over a cup of pens. They clattered onto the floor. But I didn't look down. I turned the phone over. The screen lit up. A banner from the First National Bank app was sitting there, glowing in the dim light. Deposit received. I unlocked the phone. I tapped the app. The little loading circle spun. Round and round. It felt like it was spinning for an eternity. Then, the dashboard loaded. I stared at the screen. I blinked. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. Current balance, $5,004,200.12. The number was green. It was bright. Neon. Undeniable green. It was real. The air left my lungs in a sudden, sharp gasp. I felt lightheaded. The edges of my vision started to swim. I stood up, my chair rolling back and hitting the file cabinet with a loud bang. "Is everything okay over there?" Gary called out. "Bathroom," I choked out. "I need the bathroom." I didn't wait for a response. I power walked out of the office, down the hallway, and pushed through the door of the ladies' room. Thankfully, it was empty. I locked the door behind me and rushed to the sink. I turned the faucet on cold. Full blast. I cupped my hands and splashed the freezing water onto my face. Once, twice, 3 times. I looked up at the mirror. Water dripped from my chin, soaking the collar of my cheap polyester blouse. My eyes were wide, the pupils blown. I looked terrified. "It is real," I whispered to my reflection. "It is actually real." My phone rang. The sound bounced off the tiled walls, loud and shrill. I jumped, nearly slipping on the wet floor. I grabbed the phone from the counter. The caller ID said, "Home." I took a deep breath. My hands were wet and trembling as I slid my thumb across the screen to answer. "Hello?" I answered, my voice barely a whisper. Did it arrive, granddaughter? The voice on the other end stopped me cold. It was Arthur. But it wasn't the Arthur I had lived with for the past 4 years. There was no tremor in his tone. There was no rasp of age or hesitation of confusion. The voice was deep, resonant, and commanding. It was the voice of a man who was used to being listened to. "Grandpa?" I asked. "Is that you?" "The notification," he said, sounding impatient but amused. $5 million? Is it in the account?" "Yes," I said, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in my throat. "Yes, it is there. Grandpa, what is happening? The bank manager said something about a trust, Arthur Holdings?" "I imagined he would," Arthur said. "Listen to me closely. Iris, I do not have much time before your mother calls to check if I have eaten my applesauce. I need you to understand something." "I am listening," I said, leaning against the sink for support. "I did not spend 40 years working in a factory. Iris," he said, "I spent 40 years building a portfolio. That piece of land in Seattle, the one the bank manager probably mentioned, I bought it in 1982 for pennies. Everybody told me it was swampland. 6 months ago, I sold it to a logistics company for $55 million. $55 million? I repeated, the number feeling heavy on my tongue. "After taxes and fees, it is a healthy sum." He continued calmly, "But money is dangerous. Iris, it reveals things. I needed to know who in this family actually gave a damn about me, and who was just waiting for me to die. I needed a stress test." "The envelopes," I realized. "Precisely," he said. "If your father had just said thank you, if he had just shown 1 ounce of grace, the money would have been his. If Lance had treated me with basic human dignity, he would be a rich man today. But they didn't. They showed me their souls, and their souls are bankrupt." He paused. I could hear him shifting on the line. "You were the only one, Iris. You were the only one who stood up for me. You were the only one who was willing to walk into a bank and face humiliation just to keep your word to an old man. You passed." Tears mixed with the water on my face. "I just wanted to help you." "I know," he said softly, "and that is why you are the only one who deserves to share in this. But listen to me. Iris, the fun is just beginning." "What do you mean?" "Come home," he said. "Leave work, right now. Just walk out. I have sent a car for you. It is waiting out back." "A car?" "Stop asking questions and start moving," he ordered, the steel returning to his voice. "And Iris, when you walk out of that building, do not look back. You do not belong in the basement anymore." The line went dead. I stared at the phone. Then, I looked at the mirror one last time. I wiped my face with a paper towel. I straightened my blouse. I walked back into the office. Gary was standing by my desk, holding the stack of manifests. "Iris, where have you been?" he snapped. "We have a deadline." I looked at Gary. I looked at his stained tie. I looked at the mountain of paperwork that represented the next 10 years of my life if I stayed. "I am leaving." "Gary," I said. "Leaving?" he scoffed. "For the day? You can't leave. We are backed up." "No," I said. I reached down, picked up my purse, and slung it over my shoulder. "I am leaving for good. I quit." Gary's jaw dropped. "You can't quit. You need this job. You have rent. You have that loan." I smiled. It was the first genuine smile I had felt in years. "Not anymore," I said. I walked past him, past the cubicles, past the time clock I had punched thousands of times. I walked out the back exit into the alleyway. Waiting there, idling next to the dumpster, was a sleek, black Lincoln Navigator with tinted windows. A man in a dark suit was standing by the rear door. When he saw me, he opened it. "Ms. Silverton?" he asked. "Yes," I said. I climbed in. The interior smelled of leather and expensive cologne. As the car pulled away, I didn't look back at the Nexus archives. Arthur was right. I didn't belong there anymore. The ride to the apartment took 20 minutes. When we pulled up to the curb, I saw two more large men in suits standing outside the front door of our building. They looked like Secret Service agents guarding a foreign dignitary, completely out of place against the peeling paint and graffiti of our neighborhood. One of them nodded to me as I approached. "He is upstairs, ma'am." I ran up the 3 flights of stairs, my heart pounding with a mixture of adrenaline and anticipation. I unlocked the door and burst inside. "Grandpa?" I stopped dead in my tracks. The apartment was the same faded wallpaper, the same leaky faucet dripping in the kitchen, but the man sitting at the kitchen table was a stranger. Arthur Silverton was no longer wearing the moth-eaten cardigan or the stained sweatpants he usually wore around the house. He was wearing a suit, and not the polyester brown monstrosity from Christmas Eve. This was a suit of charcoal gray wool, perfectly tailored to his frame. He wore a crisp white shirt with French cuffs and silk cufflinks. His hair was combed back. He was shaved. He was sitting upright, reading a document on a sleek new tablet. He looked 10 years younger. He looked powerful. He looked up at me and smiled. It was a wolfish smile. "Sit down, Iris," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. I sat. "Grandpa, you look amazing." "I feel amazing," he said. "It is exhausting playing the role of a senile old fool. My back was killing me from all that slouching." He pushed the tablet aside. "All right, we have work to do. The $5 million is your liquid cash. Walking around money. Use it." "Use it?" I asked. "For what?" "For everything," he said. "First, pay off your debts. Every cent. Student loans, credit cards, whatever you have, wipe the slate clean. Second, I want you to buy a house. Not a house, a fortress. Somewhere safe. Somewhere with a view. I am tired of looking at brick walls." "Okay," I nodded, my mind reeling. "I can do that." "Third," he said, leaning forward, his eyes locking onto mine. "And this is the most important rule. Absolute silence." "Silence?" "Your parents and your brother do not know," he said. "They think I'm crazy. They think the checks were fake. They think we are currently living in squalor, regretting our dramatic exit. We are going to let them keep thinking that." "Why?" I asked. "Because the look on their faces when they find out is going to be worth more than $55 million, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We are going to let them dig their own graves. We are going to let them continue to treat us like dirt. And while they are busy looking down on us, we are going to buy the ground they are standing on." I felt a shiver run down my spine. It was a cold, calculating plan, and I loved it. "Okay," I said. Silence. "Good," Arthur said. "Now, go. You have shopping to do. And Iris, get yourself a decent car. That death trap you drive is an insult to the Silverton name." The next 6 hours were a blur of high-stakes transactions. I sat in my room with my laptop, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I logged into the student loan portal. The balance stared back at me. $42,000. A number that had hung over my head like a guillotine for a decade. I clicked Make a Payment. I typed in the full amount. I hit Submit. Processing payment. Successful. Remaining balance. 0. I stared at the screen. I waited for the euphoria, but it felt more like relief, like a heavy weight had been physically lifted off my chest. I did the same with my credit cards. 0, 0, 0. Then, I opened a real estate app. I filtered for high-rise, penthouse, immediate availability. I found it. A 3-bedroom penthouse in the Skyline District, floor-to-ceiling windows, private elevator, 24-hour concierge. It was listed for $3.2 million. I called the agent. I told her I wanted to see it immediately. I told her I was a cash buyer. Her tone changed from dismissive to obsequious in 3 seconds flat. By 6 o'clock that evening, I had signed the papers. By 7, I was at a luxury dealership, pointing at a silver sedan that looked fast even when it was parked. But amidst the whirlwind of spending, the hardest part was the silence. My phone buzzed again. It was a text from my mother. Mom. Iris. Bring Grandpa's medical insurance card over. We need to check if his policy covers long-term psychiatric care. And pick up my dry cleaning on your way. The ticket is on the counter. I stared at the message. Yesterday, I would have replied instantly. I would have apologized. I would have driven over there, head down, and done exactly what she asked. I looked at the phone. I looked at Arthur, who was calmly sipping a cup of tea in his new suit. I typed a reply. Iris. No. I deleted it. No. That was too much. Too suspicious. I put the phone down. I didn't reply at all. I let it ring. The silence was not empty. It was full. It was heavy with power. For the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting to them. I was acting for myself. I walked into the kitchen. I put an offer on the penthouse, I told Arthur. We can move in 3 days. Excellent, Arthur said, not looking up from his tablet. Pack light. We are leaving the past behind. I stood by the window of our crappy apartment, looking out at the snow falling on the dirty street. Somewhere across town, my parents were drinking wine, laughing about the crazy old man and his fake checks. They were planning to put him in a home. They were planning to write me off as a failure. Let them laugh. Let them plan. I checked my bank balance one last time. $5,003,800. The game had changed, and they didn't even know they were playing. While I was busy building a fortress, the walls of the Silverton Empire were beginning to crumble. I did not witness the initial cracks personally, but thanks to the frantic voicemails, the subsequent legal depositions, and the sheer predictability of my family's greed, I can reconstruct the events of that week with terrifying accuracy. It was a comedy of errors, performed by people who thought they were the directors. It started with Lance. 7 days after Christmas. My brother was not sitting on a beach in Dubai as he had bragged. He was sitting in his home office, a room that smelled of stale energy drinks and desperation. The cryptocurrency market, which he had claimed was the future of finance, had taken a nosedive. The specific coin he had leveraged everything on, something ridiculous called moon rocket, had crashed by 90% overnight. Lance was not just broke, he was underwater. He owed money to people who did not send polite letters from collections agencies. He owed money to people who broke kneecaps. He was pacing his office, sweating through his designer t-shirt, looking for a lifeline. He had already maxed out his credit cards. He had already borrowed from his wife's savings. He needed cash, and he needed it immediately. That was when his eyes landed on the wastebasket in the corner. The maid, likely tired of his temper, had not emptied it since Christmas. A memory flickered in his panicked brain. The old man, the envelope, the joke. Lance stopped pacing. He looked at the trash can. He let out a bitter, barking laugh. "No," he muttered to himself. "Do not be an idiot. It is a piece of paper." But desperation is a powerful hallucinogen. He thought, what if? Not what if it is $5 million. That was impossible. But what if the old man had actually meant to write a check for $500? Or $5,000? What if the senile old bat had money stashed in a mattress somewhere and the account actually had something in it? Even a few $100 would buy him a day of interest with the loan sharks. Lance knelt down. He dug through the discarded wrapping paper, the empty Red Bull cans, and the tissues. At the bottom of the bin, stained with coffee grounds, was the crumpled white ball of paper. He fished it out. He smoothed it against the edge of his glass desk, trying to flatten the creases he had made when he threw it at Arthur's chest. $5,000,000 over $100. "Crazy old coot," Lance sneered, shaking his head. "Absolute lunatic." He pulled out his phone. He opened his banking app. He selected mobile deposit. He did it with a smirk. He did it as a joke, a way to vent his frustration. He aligned the camera with the front of the wrinkled check. Click. He flipped it over, scribbled a hasty endorsement, and took a picture of the back. Click. He typed in the amount. His thumb hovered over the zeros. 5, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. 0, 0. Let's see the error message. You piece of junk, he whispered. He hit submit. He expected a red box. He expected a notification saying invalid amount or suspected fraud. He expected the app to laugh at him. Instead, a spinning blue wheel appeared, processing, and then a green check mark, deposit submitted, funds will be available pending verification. Lance stared at the phone. He blinked. He threw the phone onto the couch and rubbed his face. Whatever, he grunted. It will bounce by noon. Stupid app. He went to sleep on the office floor, passed out from exhaustion and fear. He woke up the next morning to the sound of a notification. It was the standard chime his phone made for emails, but in the silence of the morning, it sounded like a gong. He groaned, reaching for the device, expecting a threat from his creditors. It was a push notification from the bank. Current balance update, $5,200.30. Lance froze. His breath hitched in his throat. He sat up, scrambling so fast he nearly fell off the couch. He unlocked the phone. He opened the app. There it was, under pending transactions, check deposit, positive $5 million. The scream that tore out of his throat was not human. It was the sound of a drowning man who had just been teleported to dry land. It was so loud, so primal, that his wife, Brittany, came running into the room holding a can of pepper spray, thinking they were being invaded. "Lance, what is it? Who is here?" she shrieked. Lance looked at her, his eyes wild, his face flushed with a manic, terrifying joy. He held up the phone. "He is rich!" Lance screamed. "The old bastard is actually rich!" He didn't wait for her to understand. He dialed our parents' landline. It was 7 a.m. "Pick up, pick up, pick up," Lance chanted, pacing the room. My father, Richard, answered on the 4th ring, his voice groggy with a hangover. "Lance, what is wrong? Is it the police?" "Check your envelope," Lance shouted into the receiver. "Dad, check the envelope. The one Grandpa gave you." "What?" Richard stammered. "Lance, slow down. What are you talking about?" "The check," Lance yelled. "It is real. I deposited mine. The bank took it. It says $5 million pending. It is real. Dad, do not tell me you threw it away." On the other end of the line, I can only imagine the sudden, electric jolt that went through my father's body. The hangover vanished. "Sylvia!" Richard roared, dropping the phone. "Sylvia, get up!" The scene at the Silverton mansion must have been a sight to behold. My dignified parents, who prided themselves on their decorum, were suddenly tearing their dining room apart like wild animals. They ran into the room where the Christmas wreckage still lay. The maid had not come yet. Another bill they had forgotten to pay. The table was still cluttered with the remains of the feast. "Where is it?" Sylvia shrieked, tossing napkins onto the floor. "I saw you put it down. Richard, where did you put it?" "I don't know," Richard yelled, lifting plates and looking under chargers. "I thought it was garbage." Then, they saw it. It was sitting exactly where Richard had left it, underneath the crystal wine glass. The red wine had dried in the bottom of the glass, leaving a sticky purple ring. The envelope was pinned beneath the base. Richard grabbed the glass. It was stuck. The dried sugar in the wine had acted like glue, adhering the glass to the paper. "Careful," Sylvia hissed, hovering over him like a vulture. "Do not tear it. If you tear the routing number, it is worthless." With trembling hands, sweating profusely in his silk pajamas, Richard carefully peeled the envelope away from the glass. There was a purple ring stain right in the center of the white paper, soaking through to the check inside. He ripped the envelope open. He pulled out the check. The stain had bled onto the memo line, but the numbers, the all-important numbers, were crisp and clear. Pay to the order of Richard and Sylvia Silverton. Amount, $5,000,000 over $100. "Oh my God," Sylvia whispered, touching the paper as if it were a holy relic. $5 million. He wasn't lying. The crazy old fool was telling the truth. "Quick," Richard said, his voice shaking. Get your phone. Mobile deposit. Before he changes his mind. Before he dies. Hurry. They huddled together, two sharks in pajamas, photographing the wine-stained check. They held their breath as the app processed the image. Deposit submitted, pending review. It took it, Richard gasped, collapsing into a dining chair. It took it. We are saved, Sylvia cried, actual tears of relief streaming down her face. Richard, we are saved. The marina deal, the credit lines, we can pay it all off. Pay it off? Richard laughed, a manic, greedy sound that echoed Lance's earlier scream. Sylvia, darling, this is $5 million. We do not just pay off debts. We leverage this. We are back in the game. Do you understand? We are back on top. The insanity that followed was a textbook case of counting chickens before they hatched. Cooked and eaten to a rational person. Pending means wait. It means the bank is checking. It means do not spend this money. But my family was not rational. They were addicts, and their drug of choice was status. The sight of that number in their account, even in gray text, was enough to break whatever tether to reality they had left. They assumed that because the app accepted the photo, the money was guaranteed. They assumed that Arthur, being samly fast, would never cancel the check. They assumed the universe owed them this. Richard made the first call. He called the yacht broker he had been stringing along for months. Jim, Richard shouted, his voice booming with renewed arrogance. Good news. The liquidity issue is resolved. I am wiring the deposit for the Sea Ray this afternoon. Yes, the 50-footer, and add the teak decking package. I want it ready for the spring season. Sylvia was next. She didn't even call. She got dressed in her finest fur coat, drove straight to the luxury jeweler in the city center, and asked to see the private collection. She put a deposit down on a yellow diamond necklace using a credit card she knew was maxed out, telling the manager, "Run it tomorrow. A large transfer is clearing my account as we speak. I just want to secure the piece before anyone else grabs it." The manager, seeing the pending screenshot she proudly displayed, nodded and bowed. But Lance was the worst. Lance called him creditor, a man named Vinny who ran a devastatingly high-interest loan operation out of a back room in a strip club. "Vinny, my man," Lance said, his voice dripping with bravado. "I told you I was good for it. I am clearing the whole balance, plus the vigorish. Yeah, tomorrow. The wire hits tomorrow. I am sending you a screenshot right now. 5 big ones. I am practically a whale. Vinny, you should be paying me for the privilege of lending to me." He hung up the phone, feeling like a king. He had just promised money he didn't have to a man who used a tire iron as a negotiating tool. By noon, the euphoria had settled into a kind of frantic planning. They gathered at the mansion. Richard, Sylvia, Lance, and Brittany. They opened a bottle of Dom Perignon, the last one in the cellar, to toast their genius. To Arthur, Richard toasted, raising his glass high. The eccentric, wonderful, totally sane old man. "We need to get him here," Sylvia said suddenly, her eyes narrowing. "We need to make sure he stays happy. If he writes checks like this, who knows what else he has? We need to lock this down. We need conservatorship, but we need him to sign it willingly." "Right," Lance agreed, pouring himself a glass. "We need to butter him up, love-bomb him, make him feel like the King of England." "Call Iris," Richard commanded. "Tell her to bring him over for dinner. No, not dinner. A party. A belated birthday party. He likes cake, right? Old people like cake." Sylvia pulled out her phone. She composed her face, forcing a smile even though I couldn't see her. She dialed my number. I was sitting in the living room of my new penthouse, watching the snow fall over the city skyline. Arthur was sitting opposite me, reading a book on philosophy. My phone rang. "Mom." I looked at Arthur. He lowered his book. He knew. "Put it on speaker," he said calmly. I tapped the screen. "Iris, darling." Sylvia's voice filled the room. It was so sweet, so saccharine. It sounded like it had been dipped in corn syrup. "How are you? We were just sitting here, missing you so much." I didn't say anything. I just let the silence stretch. "Are you there, sweetie?" she asked, a hint of nervous tension creeping in. "Listen, we were thinking we were all so tired on Christmas Eve. We didn't really get to celebrate properly, and we feel simply terrible about how rush everything was. Is that so?" I asked, my voice flat. "Oh, absolutely," she continued, the lie rolling off her tongue effortlessly. "So, we want to throw a party for Grandpa, a big celebration of his life. We want you both to come over tonight. We will order his favorite food. We can look at old photo albums. It will be magical. Just family. We miss him so much." Richard's voice piped up in the background. "Tell him I bought that scotch he likes. The cheap stuff. Just kidding. Only the best for Dad. And tell him I love the gift," Lance shouted, his voice slurring slightly. "Best Christmas ever." Arthur looked at the phone. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He simply looked at the device with a detached curiosity, as if he were studying a particularly interesting bug. He signaled for me to mute the phone. I did. "They have spent it," Arthur said. "They haven't even received it yet, and they have already spent it." "How do you know?" I asked. "Because that is the sound of people who think they have won," he replied. "Unmute it." I tapped the screen again. "Iris? Hello?" Sylvia's voice was getting shrill. "We will be there," I said. "Tonight, 7:00. "Perfect," Sylvia practically squealed. "Oh, it is going to be wonderful. Wear something nice. Honey, we might take another picture." She hung up. Arthur stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the city, his reflection ghosting in the glass. "They are celebrating their own funeral," he said softly. "Tonight, we wear black." The drive to the Silverton estate was smooth, a stark contrast to the rattling, bone-shaking journey we had taken just a week prior. My new silver sedan glided over the fresh snow, the heated leather seats keeping the winter chill at bay. Beside me, Arthur sat in silence. He was no longer the sharp, commanding businessman who had ordered me to buy a penthouse. He had begun his transformation the moment we turned onto the private road. His shoulders slumped forward, his chin dropped toward his chest. He began to tremble, a subtle vibration of his hands that looked entirely involuntary. He was putting the mask back on. "Remember," I whispered as the house came into view, blazing with light like a cruise ship in the dark. "We parked down the street." "I know," Arthur mumbled, his voice taking on that familiar, fragile rasp. "I am old. Iris, not deaf. Park behind the hedge. Let's make them walk to us." I parked the car in the shadows of a large oak tree, well away from the driveway where Richard's leased BMW and Lance's sports car were prominently displayed. We walked the final 100 yards in the cold. I held Arthur's arm, not because he needed support, but because I could feel the tension radiating off him. We were walking into a den of vipers, and we were doing it with open arms. I rang the doorbell. It did not open. It flew open. Usually, we would wait 5 minutes for the maid to arrive, or for someone to begrudgingly tear themselves away from the television. Tonight, the door swung wide before the chime had even finished echoing. "Dad! Daddy!" It was Sylvia, my mother, who had spent the last decade complaining about Arthur's smell in his stories, launched herself at him. She was wearing a red velvet dress and enough perfume to suffocate a small animal. She wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his worn coat. "Oh, look at you," she cooed, pulling back to hold his face in her hands. "You look wonderful. Doesn't he look wonderful, Richard?" My father appeared behind her, a glass of scotch in one hand and a cigar in the other. His face was flushed, his eyes bright with a manic energy that made my skin crawl. "He looks like $1,000,000, Richard boomed, then corrected himself with a greedy chuckle. $5,000,000. Come in. Come in. Get out of the cold. Pop, you shouldn't be out in this weather. It is bad for your constitution." They ushered him inside, treating him like a fragile Ming vase they had just discovered in the attic. Hands were everywhere, patting his back, guiding his elbow, smoothing his hair. It was a grotesque display of affection, terrifying because of its absolute insincerity. I stood in the doorway, the cold wind at my back, completely ignored. I closed the door and followed them. "Iris," Richard said, finally acknowledging my presence as he helped Arthur out of his coat. He didn't look at me. His eyes were glued to the inner pocket of Arthur's suit jacket, checking for more envelopes. "Why didn't you tell us? We had no idea Dad was sitting on such a nest egg. You kept it a secret. That was very selfish of you. Sweetheart." "I didn't know," I lied, keeping my face blank. "He surprised me too." "Well, it is all out in the open now," Sylvia chirped, linking her arm through Arthur's. "Come, Dad, we have set the table. We made your favorite, roast beef and mashed potatoes, soft foods, easy to chew." They led him to the dining room. This time, there was no kid's table in the corner. They placed Arthur at the head of the table. In the high-backed chair usually reserved for Richard, the table was set with the good china, the gold-rimmed plates that were only used for visiting dignitaries. Lance and Brittany were already seated. Lance jumped up as if he had been sitting on a spring. "Grandpa!" Lance shouted, rushing over to shake Arthur's hand. He pumped it vigorously. "Man, it is good to see you. Truly, you are looking sharp. Is that a new tie? Classic? Vintage? I love it. We need to talk business later. You and me. I have some ideas that are right up your alley." Arthur looked at Lance with wide, watery eyes. He blinked slowly. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice quavering. Lance faltered for a second, his smile twitching. "It is me, Grandpa, Lance, your grandson." "Oh," Arthur said, staring past him at a candlestick. "Lance, the one who owes the bad men money." The room went silent. Lance turned a shade of pale green. Richard coughed loudly. "Dad is so funny." Richard laughed, a booming, forced sound. "Always the joker. Sit down. Everyone, let's eat." The dinner was a masterclass in manipulation, or at least, they thought it was. To me, it was a psychological horror show. They poured Arthur expensive wine, filling his glass to the brim. They piled his plate high with food, and between every bite, they probed. They didn't ask about his life, his memories, or his health. They asked about the mechanics of his wealth. "So, Dad," Richard said, leaning forward, his elbows on the table. "This trust, Arthur Holdings, very impressive name. Who handles the legal side for you? Is it firm in the city? Because my friend Bob manages estates for the Rockefellers. We should really transfer your files to him, for safekeeping." Arthur took a slow, trembling bite of mashed potatoes. He chewed methodically. "The man in the hat," he said finally. "The man in the hat?" Sylvia repeated, exchanging a glance with Richard. "What is his name, Dad? Does he have a card?" "He wears a gray hat," Arthur said, nodding to himself. "And he likes pigeons." "Right," Richard said, his patience thinning just a fraction. "Okay, we will find him. And the accounts? Do you have the access codes? Written down somewhere? Maybe in a little notebook?" "I have a book," Arthur agreed. "Yes," Lance whispered, leaning in. "Where is the book, Grandpa?" "I think I left it on the bus," Arthur said. "In 1994. I took a sip of my water to hide my smile. He was playing them like a fiddle. He was giving them just enough nonsense to frustrate them, but keeping the allure of the money so strong that they couldn't snap at him. They were hostages to their own greed. "We will look for the book later," Sylvia said soothingly, patting Arthur's hand. "Don't you worry about a thing. We are going to take care of everything now. You won't have to lift a finger. In fact, Richard and I were looking at brochures for that lovely assisted living facility in the Hamptons, the one with the ocean view. It is 5 stars. We think you would love it there." "Expensive," Arthur muttered. "Money is no object now," Richard declared, slamming his hand on the table jovially. We are flush. Dad, thank you. In fact, I made a little move today, a celebration. He looked around the table, his chest puffing out. I finally put the deposit down on the C-Ray, Richard announced. The 50-footer, the dealer was holding it for me. I wired the $50,000 this afternoon. It is non-refundable. But who cares? When that check clears tomorrow, we are going to be cruising to the Bahamas. Oh, Richard, Sylvia gasped, feigning surprise. You naughty boy. But I suppose I was naughty too, she giggled, touching the diamond necklace that wasn't there yet. I may have secured a few pieces from the vault at Cartier. Just hold items, but they are stunning. I paid Vinny, Lance blurted out. Unable to help himself, he was vibrating with adrenaline. I sent him the screenshot. He gave me a week extension on the principal, but I promised him full payment by Friday. And I put 10 grand down on a new crypto mining rig. It is going to double our money in a month. Grandpa, you are an investor. You understand leverage. Arthur looked at them. He looked at Richard, red-faced and gloating. He looked at Sylvia, calculating the carat weight of her future diamonds. He looked at Lance, desperate and foolish. You spent the money? Arthur asked softly. Invested it, Dad, Richard corrected him. We are putting it to work, just like you did with that land. Like father, like son, right? Like father, like son, Arthur repeated. The words hung in the air, heavy with a meaning only he and I understood. I sat there, cutting my roast beef into tiny, precise squares. I felt a wave of nausea, but it was mixed with a dark, cold satisfaction. They had walked into the trap. They had not just walked in, they had run in, locked the door behind them, and swallowed the key. They had leveraged themselves to the hilt, based on a photo of a piece of paper. It is a blessing, Sylvia said, raising her glass. To my family, and to Arthur. To Arthur! They all chorused. Arthur did not raise his glass. He just watched them. Suddenly, a loud, jarring ringtone cut through the toast. It was Richard's phone. He had set it to a blaring siren sound, thinking it was funny. He checked the screen. His eyebrows shot up. Speak of the devil, Richard grinned. It is Mr. Sterling, my private banker. He is probably calling to congratulate me on the deposit, or maybe to ask if I want to move the funds into a high-yield account. Put it on speaker, Lance urged. Let's hear the good news. Richard tapped the screen and placed the phone in the center of the table. Right next to the gravy boat, he leaned back, folding his arms behind his head. Mr. Sterling, Richard boomed. Good evening. To what do I owe the pleasure? Have the funds hit the ledger yet? The voice that came out of the speaker was not congratulatory. It was not warm. It was the icy, clipped tone of a man who was recording the call for legal purposes. Mr. Silverton, Mr. Sterling said, I am calling to inform you that the check you attempted to deposit via mobile capture has been returned. The smile on Richard's face faltered. Returned? What do you mean, returned? Like for a signature? I can sign it again. Returned unpaid. Mr. Silverton, the banker said. The issuing institution has flagged the instrument. The specific code is stop payment, maker's request. The account holder canceled the check. The room went so quiet, I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Richard blinked. He looked at the phone, then at Arthur, then back at the phone. That is a mistake. My father gave me that check. He is sitting right here. He didn't cancel anything. Furthermore, Mr. Sterling continued, his voice dropping an octave, becoming even more severe. Due to the size of the attempted deposit and the immediate flagging by the issuing bank, our fraud algorithm has been triggered. Your accounts have been frozen pending a full investigation into check kiting and potential elder abuse fraud. Frozen? Richard squeaked. The color drained from his face so fast it looked like a curtain falling. What do you mean, frozen? I just wired $50,000 for a boat. I have outstanding checks. Those wires will not clear. Mr. Silverton, the banker said, your accounts are locked. Credit cards, checking, savings. You will need to come into the branch tomorrow morning with your attorney. Good evening. Click. The line went dead. For 10 seconds, no one moved, no one breathed. The silence was absolute. It was the silence of a bomb that had just detonated, where the shockwave hits before the sound. Richard's hands were shaking. He lowered them from behind his head. He looked at the black screen of his phone. Frozen, he whispered. The boat, the deposit. My necklace, Sylvia gasped, her hand flying to her throat. I signed the credit agreement. Vinny, Lance choked out. He pushed his chair back, the legs screeching against the floor. I sent him the screenshot. I told him it was done. If the money does not arrive, he said he would break my legs. Slowly, terrifyingly, 3 pairs of eyes turned toward the head of the table. They looked at Arthur. Arthur was no longer hunching. He was no longer trembling. He picked up his napkin, dabbed the corners of his mouth, and placed it neatly on the table. He reached for his wine glass, the one they had filled to the brim, and took a long, steady sip. He set the glass down with a sharp clink. He looked at Richard. The vacancy was gone from his eyes. The senile old man had vanished, replaced by the shark who had bought industrial wasteland and turned it into gold. The man in the hat, Arthur said, his voice clear, strong, and dripping with disdain. His name is Consequences, and it seems he has finally come to collect. Richard stood up, his chair tipping over backward with a crash. You, he stammered, pointing a shaking finger at his father. You canceled it? You canceled the check? I did, Arthur said calmly. Why? Sylvia shrieked, standing up to join her husband. Why would you do that? We are your family. You gave it to us. I gave you a test, Arthur said. And you failed. It was a gift, Lance yelled. You can't take back a gift. I can take back anything I want, Arthur said. Especially when that gift was treated like garbage. You laughed at me. You threw it at me. You used it as a coaster. You mocked me to my face because you thought I was too stupid to understand. Did you really think I would let you keep $5 million after that? But we spent it, Richard screamed, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. We spent the money. We have commitments. If that money does not clear, we are ruined. Do you understand? Ruined. Arthur looked at him. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. Then I suggest, Arthur said, that you learn to swim, because the ship is sinking. Iris reached under the table and squeezed Arthur's hand. His grip was iron strong. The trap had snapped shut. The kiting was over, and the lions were in the cage. The silence that had gripped the dining room following the banker's call was shattered not by a scream, but by a sound far more terrifying in the digital age. It was the synchronized chime of 2 more mobile phones receiving the same catastrophic notification. Lance's phone, lying on the table next to his empty wine glass, lit up. Sylvia's phone, clutched in her manicured hand, vibrated violently against the wood. The sound was innocent, cheerful even, but the effect was immediate. Lance snatched his phone up as if it were a grenade that had just had the pin pulled. He stared at the screen, his eyes widening until they looked like they might pop out of his skull. Transaction failed, Lance read, his voice cracking into a high-pitched squeak. Return item charge, funds reversed, insufficient funds. He looked up, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. It is gone, he whispered. The $5 million, it just vanished. The pending bar disappeared. It says negative balance. It says my account is overdrawn by $10,000 because I spent money I did not have. Mine too, Sylvia gasped, dropping her phone onto her plate. It landed in the mashed potatoes with a wet thud. The deposit says, rejected by issuer. It says, stop payment. Richard, who was still standing by his overturned chair, looked from his wife to his son. The blood that had drained from his face earlier was now rushing back, turning his complexion a mottled, angry red. He slammed his fist onto the table. making the silverware jump. "Why?" Richard screamed, the sound tearing at his throat. "It was there. It was pending. Lance saw it. I saw it. We took the picture. How can it just disappear?" He spun around to face Arthur. My father looked deranged, his hair disheveled, sweat beading on his upper lip. He pointed a shaking finger at the man he had been hugging 10 minutes ago. "You!" Richard roared. "You did something. You messed with the app. You confused the system." Arthur did not flinch. He did not cower. In fact, he moved with a slowness that was almost insulting. He picked up his linen napkin from his lap. He unfolded it. He dabbed the corners of his mouth, removing a speck of gravy. Then, he folded the napkin into a perfect square and placed it beside his plate. He placed his hands on the edge of the table and pushed his chair back. The scrape of wood against wood was deliberate and controlled. Arthur looked up. The transformation was complete. The cloudy eyes were gone. The tremor in his hands had vanished. The hunched shoulders were squared. He looked at Richard with an expression of such cold, piercing intelligence that my father actually took a step back. "The system is not confused, Richard," Arthur said. His voice was no longer the rasp of an old man. It was deep, resonant, and struck the room like a gavel. "The system worked exactly as I instructed it to." "Instructed?" Richard stammered. "What are you talking about?" Arthur reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, the same pocket where the envelopes had been hidden on Christmas Eve. He pulled out his smartphone. It wasn't the old flip phone they thought he used. It was the latest model, sleek and black. He tapped the screen a few times, his movements precise, and turned the device around so they could all see. "Look at the timestamp," Arthur commanded. Richard leaned in, squinting. Lance scrambled up from his chair to look. Sylvia wiped the potato off her screen to compare. "December 24th, Arthur read aloud, his voice steady. 11:42 at night, approximately 1 hour after I left this house. 1 hour after you laughed in my face. 1 hour after you threw my gift into the garbage." On the screen was a digital confirmation from the bank's high net worth portal. Status: stop payment issued. Reason: lost/stolen/destroyed. Authorized by Arthur J. Silverton. "I canceled them that night," Arthur said, retracting the phone and sliding it back into his pocket. "The moment Iris drove me away from this house, I called my private banker. I told him that the checks had been rejected by the recipients. I told him to void them immediately." "You canceled them?" Lance choked out. "But I deposited it yesterday. It said pending." "Because the banking system is slower than your greed," Arthur replied, his eyes locking onto his grandson. "The automated system accepted the image, yes. It credited your account provisionally, trusting that the check was valid. But the moment the digital image hit the clearinghouse this afternoon, it matched the stop payment order I placed a week ago. The trap was set the moment you decided to fish that check out of the trash." "But it is real money," Richard shouted, pounding the table again. "You have the money. You admitted it. You can't just dangle $5 million in front of us and then snatch it away. That is cruel. That is sick." "Cruel?" Arthur stood up. He rose to his full height, and for the first time, I realized how tall he actually was. He loomed over the table, a titan in a gray suit. "Cruel is inviting your father to a dinner only to mock his clothes. Cruel is laughing when an old man tries to share his life's work with you. Cruel is treating your own blood like a nuisance until you think he can buy you a yacht." "I did not know," Richard yelled. "I thought you were senile. I thought it was a joke." "And that is your defense?" Arthur asked, his voice dripping with disdain. "That you only treated me like garbage because you thought I was poor? That if you had known I was rich, you would have been kind? Do you have any idea how pathetic that sounds?" "I gave you a chance," Arthur continued, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I walked into this house with $15 million in my pocket. If any of you, had simply said, Thank you. If you had treated me with an ounce of respect, that money would be sitting in your accounts right now, legally, irrevocably, but you didn't. You laughed. You called it toilet paper. You used it as a coaster. He pointed a finger at the wine glass Richard had peeled the check from. I do not pay for people who use my legacy to catch their spills, Arthur said. I canceled the checks because you told me, with your own actions, that they were worthless to you. I simply agreed with you. The reality of the situation began to crash down on them. The denial was fading, replaced by a raw, primal panic. Lance was the first to break. The bravado, the arrogance of the crypto bro, evaporated instantly. He thought of Vinny. He thought of the screenshot he had sent. He thought of the promise he had made. He dropped to his knees. He didn't just kneel. He collapsed. He crawled around the edge of the table, grabbing the hem of Arthur's trousers. Grandpa, please, Lance sobbed, tears streaming down his face, mixing with the snot running from his nose. You do not understand. I sent the screenshot. I told him the money was there. Vinny is not a bank. He is an animal. If I do not pay him tomorrow, he is going to hurt me. He said he would break my legs. Grandpa, please, you have to uncancel it, just for me. Please, I am your grandson. Arthur looked down at the weeping man clutching his leg. He looked at him with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a lab rat. You are a grown man. Lance, Arthur said cold. You made a wager. You lost. Do not ask me to pay for your gambling debts with my hard-earned money. He will kill me, Lance shrieked, tightening his grip. He will actually kill me. Then perhaps you should have thought about that before you mocked the man who could have saved you, Arthur said. He shook his leg, dislodging Lance's grip, and stepped back. Richard, seeing his son on the floor, went from shock to a blind, defensive rage. The narcissist in him could not accept defeat. He needed someone to blame. This is fraud, Richard screamed, his face turning purple. This is entrapment. You set us up. I will sue you. I will get the best lawyers in the state. You wrote a check. You have to honor it. That is a contract. I will drag you to court, and I will take every penny you have. I will leave you destitute. Go ahead, Arthur said, his voice calm amidst the screaming. Sue me. My legal team is led by the former Attorney General of the state. I have video evidence of you mocking the gift. I have the timestamp of the cancellation. I have witnesses. Please, Richard, spend the last of your money on lawyers. I would enjoy watching you lose that, too. Sylvia, realizing that threats and begging were failing, tried the only card she had left. She rounded the table, tears streaming down her face. Real tears this time. Tears of terror. She reached out for Arthur, trying to grab his hands. Dad, she wailed, her voice trembling. Daddy, please, look at us. We are your family. We are your blood. How can you be so cold? We made a mistake. Yes, we were stressed. We were tired. But we love you. We are the only family you have. You can't just watch us drown. You can't let Richard lose the business. You can't let Lance get hurt. We are your flesh and blood. She fell to her knees beside Lance, creating a tableau of misery on the expensive Persian rug. Blood, Arthur repeated. He looked at them. He looked at the woman who had criticized his smell. He looked at the son who had wished him into a nursing home. You talk about blood, Arthur said, his voice shaking with a sudden, controlled fury. Let me tell you about blood. Blood does not leave its father to rot in a cold apartment for 3 years. Blood does not invite its grandfather over only to use him as a prop for a social media photo. Blood does not laugh when its kin offers a gift. He leaned down, bringing his face close to theirs. You are not my blood, Arthur hissed. You are parasites. You have fed on the memory of the Silverton name while doing nothing to earn it. And now that the host has decided to cut you off, you are starving. That is not tragedy. Sylvia, that is biology. As if on cue, The world outside decided to breach the walls of the mansion. Richard's phone, still on the table, began to ring again. It wasn't the banker this time. The caller ID flashed a name, Yacht Broker Jim. Then Lance's phone buzzed on the floor. A text message, then another, then a call. Unknown number. Then the landline in the hallway began to ring. The shrill, mechanical sound echoed through the house. "Answer it," Arthur said, gesturing to the ringing phones. "That is the sound of reality calling." Richard stared at his phone. "It is the broker," he whispered, terrified. The wire must have bounced. He is going to claim breach of contract. Lance looked at his phone. His face went white. "It is Vinny," he whimpered. "He knows. The deposit reversed. He knows." The house, usually so quiet and insulated from the world, was suddenly vibrating with noise, ringing, buzzing, chimes. It was a cacophony of consequences. "Make it stop!" Sylvia screamed, covering her ears. "Dad, make it stop. Write the check, please. Just write it again." "I cannot," Arthur said, straightening his cuffs. "I have a plane to catch." "Plane?" Richard gasped. "Where are you going?" "Away," Arthur said. "To a place where people appreciate me, to a life I have put on hold for too long, waiting for you to grow up." He turned to me. "Iris, are the bags in the car?" "Yes, Grandpa," I said, standing up. My voice was steady. I felt no pity for them. I looked at my brother, cowering on the floor. I looked at my father, a hollow shell of a man. I looked at my mother, whose vanity had finally cost her everything. "Then let's go," Arthur said. He turned his back on them. He began to walk toward the door. Richard scrambled after him, grabbing his arm. "You can't leave. You can't leave us with this mess. The debt, the loans, they will take the house. They will take everything." Arthur stopped. He looked at Richard's hand on his sleeve until Richard, shamed by the glare, let go. "They won't take the house, Richard," Arthur said softly. "They won't?" Richard asked, a glimmer of hope sparking in his eyes. "You paid off the mortgage?" "No," Arthur smiled. It was a cold, final smile. "I didn't pay it off for you," he gestured to me. I stepped forward. I opened my purse. I pulled out a thick folder of documents. I hadn't just bought a penthouse that week. I had been busy. "What is this?" Richard asked, staring at the folder I held out. "Open it," I said. Richard opened the folder. His eyes scanned the first page, then the second. His knees gave way, and he collapsed back against the wall, sliding down until he hit the floor. "No," Richard whispered. "That is impossible." "What is it?" Sylvia cried. Crawling over to him, she snatched the papers. She read them. She screamed. "Iris?" she gasped, looking at me with horror. "You bought the note?" "The bank was very happy to sell your distressed mortgage," I said calmly, "especially when the buyer offered cash, $5 million, to be exact, the exact amount of the check you used as a coaster." "You own the house?" Lance whispered, looking up from his fetal position. "I do," I said. "And as the new owner, I am afraid I have some bad news. I am foreclosing. You have 30 days to vacate the premises." The silence that followed was total. The phones had stopped ringing for a brief second, leaving only the sound of their heavy, terrified breathing. 30 days, Arthur repeated. "I suggest you start packing. I hear the rental market is very competitive this time of year." He turned and walked out the door. Into the cold night air. I followed him, leaving the door wide open behind us, letting the winter wind blow into the house that was no longer theirs. Desperation is a chemical state. I could smell it on my father as he stood in the hallway of the home he no longer owned. It was a sour, acrid scent that cut through his expensive cologne and the lingering aroma of the roast beef he had choked on. The revelation that the house was gone, that I was the one holding the deed, had shattered the last remnants of his composure. He looked at Arthur, who was standing by the open door, buttoning his coat against the winter chill. He looked at the phone in Arthur's pocket. the device that held the power to transfer millions. The device he believed could still save him if he could just force his father's hand. Richard did not think. He reacted, with a guttural roar that sounded more like a wounded animal than a human being. Richard lunged. He threw himself across the marble foyer, his hands clawed, aiming for Arthur's chest. "Give it to me!" Richard screamed, his eyes bulging. "Give me the phone! You owe me this!" He never reached him. I did not flinch. I did not scream. I simply took one step to the side and snapped my fingers. The two men who had been waiting in the shadows of the porch, the professional security detail I had hired earlier that day, using a fraction of my new wealth, stepped into the light. They moved with the fluid, practiced efficiency of predators. One of them, a man whose neck was wider than my father's head, intercepted Richard in midair. He didn't strike him. He simply caught him. He grabbed Richard by the lapels of his velvet dinner jacket and slammed him back against the wall. The sound of the impact was dull and heavy. A painting of a hunting scene rattled on its hook. "Stay down," the guard said. His voice was low, devoid of anger, purely transactional. Lance, seeing his father pinned like a butterfly in a display case, made a move to stand up from where he was cowering on the floor. The second guard simply looked at him and took a half step forward. Lance froze, then slowly sank back down to the carpet, raising his hands in surrender. "Iris!" Sylvia shrieked, clutching her pearls. "Call them off! Are you insane? This is your father." "No," I said, walking over to where my purse sat on the entry table. "That is a man who just tried to assault an 80-year-old man. If he moves again, I will have him arrested for battery, and unlike the police, my employees do not need a warrant to restrain him." I opened my bag. The leather was soft and cool under my fingers. I pulled out the second file, the thick, heavy dossier I had compiled with the help of a private investigator I had retained 48 hours ago. "You think this is just about the check," I said, my voice echoing in the sudden silence of the hallway. "You think this is just about Arthur canceling a gift because you were rude. You think you are victims of a misunderstanding." I walked over to the console table and slammed the file down. The sound was like a gunshot. "This," I said, "is the reason you are finished." I flipped the file open. I picked up the first document, a credit report obtained through a forensic accountant. "Richard," I began, looking at my father, who was wheezing against the wall, held in place by the guard's forearm. "Did you think we wouldn't find out? The credit lines you opened in Arthur's name 3 years ago? The ones you used to fund your consulting firm that never had a single client?" Richard went pale. "That was a temporary bridge loan. I intended to pay it back." "You defaulted," I cut him off. "You let the collections agencies harass a man living on a pension. You let them threaten him, and you blocked their numbers on his phone so he wouldn't know it was you who stole his identity." I tossed the paper onto the floor. It fluttered down, landing near his feet. I turned to my mother. She was trembling, backing away from me. "And you?" "Sylvia," I said, pulling out a series of pawn shop receipts. "Grandma's jewelry box. The one you told Arthur was stolen by the cleaning lady? The one you filed a police report for?" I held up a photo of a vintage sapphire brooch. "You sold it. You sold her engagement ring. You sold her locket. And you used the money to buy that Birkin bag you are so proud of." Sylvia let out a strangled sob. "I needed to maintain appearances. The other wives do not understand the pressure. Iris?" "I understand theft," I said coldly. "I understand that you looked at the only heirlooms your husband's mother left behind, and you saw a handbag." I dropped the receipts. They scattered like confetti. "You have been bleeding him dry for years," I continued, my voice rising just enough to fill the cavernous space. "You treated him like a burden while you were picking his pockets. You waited for him to die so you could inherit whatever scraps were left. Well, surprise, the scraps are gone, and so is the main course." I walked over to Richard. I signaled the guard to let him go. The guard stepped back, but kept his eyes locked on my father. Richard slumped against the wall, rubbing his chest. The $5 million you thought was yours? I asked. The money you thought would save your boat and your reputation? It did go somewhere. Dad, it went to the bank. I pulled the deed out of the folder. The blue legal paper crinkled in my hand. I bought the note, I said. Every cent of principal, every cent of interest, every penalty fee you have ignored for 6 months, I paid it all, this morning at 9 o'clock. Richard stared at the paper. His eyes were wide, uncomprehending. You paid my mortgage? My mortgage, I corrected him. I am the lien holder. I am the bank. And since you are currently 180 days in arrears, I have exercised the acceleration clause. I leaned in closer. You are not just broke, Dad. You are trespassing. You can't do this, Lance whispered from the floor. We are family. You have 30 days, I said, looking at my brother. 30 days to pack your bags. 30 days to find a place that accepts unemployed crypto bros and socialites with no credit rating. After that, the locks change. And if you are still here, the sheriff will remove you. And the house? Sylvia gasped. What will you do with the house? You are going to live here? In our home? I looked around the foyer. I looked at the gold leaf molding. I looked at the pretentious chandelier. I looked at the portrait of my parents hanging above the stairs, smiling their fake, plastic smiles. Live here? I laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. I wouldn't live here if it was the last shelter on earth. This place smells like rot. I turned to Arthur. Tell them? Arthur stepped forward. He adjusted his cuffs. He looked at the house he had visited so many times. The house where he had been made to feel small. The property will be liquidated, Arthur said. The proceeds from the sale will not go to me. They will not go to Iris. They will be donated entirely to the Oak Ridge Shelter for the Homeless. He smiled a thin, sharp smile. It seems fitting. The house you used to show off your wealth will be used to help the people you spent your lives ignoring. No, Richard screamed. That is my legacy. That is my house. It was never your house, Richard, Arthur said quietly. It was just a costume you couldn't afford. Arthur turned his back on them. He walked past Richard without a glance. He walked past Sylvia, who was weeping into her hands. He walked toward the open door, where the cold, clean air of the night was waiting. Grandpa, Lance called out weakly, where will we go? Arthur stopped on the threshold. He didn't turn around. I hear the real world is very educational, Arthur said. I suggest you start taking notes. He looked at me. Ready, Iris? Ready, I said. Good, he nodded. We have a flight to catch. Zurich is beautiful this time of year, and I have a meeting with a banker who actually knows how to tie a tie. I followed him out. Behind us, the sounds of the Silverton dynasty collapsing were loud and ugly. Richard was shouting profanities, blaming Sylvia for spending too much. Sylvia was screaming at Richard for his failed investments. Lance was crying into his phone, likely leaving a desperate voicemail for Vinny. I didn't look back, not once. I walked down the stone steps. The snow had stopped falling. The sky above was a deep, bruised purple, clearing to reveal a tapestry of stars that looked sharper and brighter than I had ever seen them. The air was crisp, biting at my cheeks, waking me up. The black Lincoln Navigator was waiting at the bottom of the steps, its engine idling with a low, powerful rumble. The driver opened the rear door for Arthur. He climbed in, moving with the grace of a man who had finally shed a heavy weight. I walked around to the other side. I paused for a second, my hand on the door handle. I looked up at the massive, illuminated mansion one last time. It looked like a mausoleum, a beautiful, expensive tomb for 3 people who had been dead inside for a long time. I felt a vibration in my pocket. My phone, probably a text from my mother, begging, bargaining, or threatening. I took the phone out. I didn't check the screen. I pressed the power button and held it down. Power off. The screen went black. I tossed the phone onto the driveway. It skittered across the asphalt, coming to rest in a pile of dirty snow. I got into the car and pulled the door shut. The silence inside was instant and luxurious. "To the airport, ma'am?" the driver asked, meeting my eyes in the rearview mirror. "Yes," I said. "The private terminal." Arthur reached over and patted my hand. He looked at me, and his eyes were crinkling with a genuine warmth. "You did good, kid," he said. "You did real good." "I had a good teacher," I replied. The car pulled away. We glided down the long driveway, past the perfectly manicured hedges, past the iron gates that had been meant to keep the world out. We turned onto the main road, picking up speed. The lights of the Silverton estate faded into the distance, shrinking until they were nothing more than a flicker in the rearview mirror. And then, they were gone. Ahead of us, the highway stretched out, an open ribbon of asphalt leading toward the city, toward the airport, toward Switzerland, toward a future where I would never have to apologize for who I was, and where the only checks I wrote would be the ones that changed the world. The quiet grandpa was quiet no more, and neither was I. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I am curious. Where in the world are you tuning in from right now? Please let me know in the comments below. I would love to see how far our community reaches. If you enjoyed this revenge drama, please make sure to subscribe to the Sunday Drama Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button so we can share this story with even more people.